Hi there, I'm Lily and welcome to this tutorial on the GAMSAT Section 1 Short Stories. So in this tutorial we have 3 lesson aims. So we'll start by learning how to develop an approach to answering questions on short stories. Then we'll look at revising some literary terms that commonly come up on the GAMSAT. And finally we'll have a go at some sample questions. So how do I approach fictional short story questions? So it can be hard to decide whether you should read the passage first or go straight into the questions, but I definitely recommend for the GAMSAT to read the entire passage before moving on to the questions so that you have a more broad understanding of what exactly is happening in the short story before attempting any of the questions. And here are some things to look out for whilst reading the short story. So the main idea is very important. So whilst reading the text, be aware of the main idea and the actual meaning of the story. Next is the character and the author's attitude. So be very aware of the attitude and feelings expressed by either the author or any characters. Also look at how these emotions and feelings might change throughout the text, and also any relationships between the characters. And then also, you may be asked about the genre of the short story. So it's really important to become familiar with common genres. So for instance, some examples would be mystery, romance, fantasy, thriller and science fiction. So always be thinking about what genre a text could fall into whilst reading it. And now it's very important you brush up on literary terms, different writing styles and genres of short stories. So as mentioned, it's really important to brush up on different genres, literary terms and different writing styles. So we'll go over some literary terms in just a moment. And for the familiarizing yourself with various different writing styles, it's best just to read as many different sources and platforms you can. So whether it's the newspaper, magazines, books, all this will help you to become familiar with how different writers can approach writing and the different styles out there. So now I'll have a look at some literary terms to become familiar with. So here is a list of the literary terms that most commonly come up on the GAMSAT. Firstly, we have adage. So this is where a proverb or a short statement expressing a general truth is used. So for example, out of sight, out of mind. Next, we have allegory. So this is a story in which the characters or events have a hidden meaning. And this hidden meaning tends to be either a political or a philosophical one. This term is really common in section 1. Next, we have the archetype. So an archetype is an original model or a type of character which is easily recognizable and has always existed. So an example of an archetype would be a mother. Next we have hamartia. So this is probably a term you haven't come across before, but again I've seen it come up in the GAMSAT. So this is where there's a tragic flaw or a character defect within a character. Next we have hyperbole. So this is exaggerated statements or claims that are not meant to be taken literally. Irony is the expression of one's meaning by using language that normally signifies the opposite, and this is typically used for humorous or emphatic effect. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which an object or an idea is symbolically used to represent another or in order to simplify or intensify the comparison. Paradox. So this is a seemingly contradictory statement which nevertheless may be true, or the opposite to this. It's a statement which seems true but is in fact contradictory. Personification is the attributing of human characteristics to something non-human. So for example, if we said the sun is smiling. So smiling is a human characteristic, and here we're attributing it to the sun, which is an inanimate object. The protagonist. So this is a very important character within a short story, and it's the principal character or the participant in a real or literary event. A simile is a specific type of metaphor, so it compares items, but it actually uses specific words such as like or as. Satire is the use of humour to ridicule or criticize people or a society. And finally, we have symbolism. So this is an object or an element in a literary work which is used to understand or represent much more than its literal meaning. So there's a lot of literary terms there, but definitely take some time to become familiar with each and always be looking out for these whilst you're reading a passage. So with all of that in mind, I think it's time to move on to some sample questions. So if you'd like to pause the video at this point and have a go at answering question 1, and remember to read through the entire text before moving on to the questions. Now, moving on to the solution to question 1. So first of all, I'm just going to have a quick skim over the text. I've already read it, and I see down at the bottom, this text comes from Masque of the Red Death. So that just gives me a little bit more of an idea as to what this text is going to be about. So question 1 asks, what is the purpose of blood to the Red Death? So we notice that blood is mainly mentioned throughout the start of the first paragraph, so we'll be focusing here for our answer. So it says that blood was its avatar and its seal. So first have a think about what this means. So to me, avatar means a way it can spread, and a seal is going to be a marking. Just like how we place a seal on a letter, it's a marking. So the redness and the horror of the blood. And then it's also, blood is mentioned again, where there are sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. So if I look at the answer options now, A, it provides visible signs of its infection of a person. So this is true. It definitely does provide visible signs. As we said, its seal. Blood was its seal. So answer A is a possibility. Option B, it provides the means to infect someone and provides a visible sign of its presence. So this is also likely. So similarly, it incorporates answer A, that it provides a visible sign of its presence, and it also does provide the means to infect someone. So this also encompasses the use of the word avatar. So this option B is actually going to be a better option than option A. Although A is not incorrect, option B is a better choice because it incorporates more. So we can rule out option A now. So always remember that this is a multiple choice question, and that while some answers might technically be correct, you're always looking for the best interpretation with the closest meaning. So now we'll look at option C. It allows for rapid spread of the infection to the brain, which is where the infection attacks, causing seizures. So we're not actually sure if it specifically allows for rapid spread of the infection to the brain. This is sort of inferring too much. So we know that it's a means to infect someone, so it's an avatar and its seal. And although down the end of this, we see that the Red Death itself involves a seizure, but we don't know whether this is the blood itself. So we can rule out option C, as B is a better, more broad statement specifically to what we're being told about the blood. Option D, the blood attracts the Red Death to an individual. It enables the plague to find victims. So there's nothing in this text to actually support this answer that the blood attracts the Red Death. We just know that it simply is going to be a way it's spread and a way that we can visibly see the disease. So we can rule out option D. And that makes option B the correct answer to question 1. Now moving on to question 2, again if you'd like to pause the video at this point and have a go at answering question 2. So question 2 asks us, what does dissolution mean? So you might already know the definition of dissolution, and therefore the answer is going to be quite easy for you. But if you don't, you're going to need to rely on the text. So try to find the context of the use of this word and look around it for any more clues that might help you understand the meaning. So we see dissolution is here in paragraph 1, sentence 4. And if we read the rest of the sentence, it begins with, there are sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. So we know it's got something to do about the progression of the disease and how it proceeds once someone is infected. So if we look at option A, to fall apart and conclude. So this is definitely relating to the progression of the disease. And we know also that this disease is fatal. So here in the second sentence, no pestilence had ever been so fatal. So we know that this actually results in death. And also even more obviously, it's called the Red Death. So to fall apart and conclude, The word conclude can also be synonymous with finality, so that will mean being a fatal disease and resulting in death. So A is quite likely. B, to gradually fall into a state of disrepair. So we're definitely deteriorating, but it's not just a state of disrepair, it's death itself. So we can rule out option B. Option C, to become infectious and highly dangerous. So this is talking specifically about what's happening to the person when they're actually infected. It's not about how it's going to be infectious to others. This is simply explaining what happens to a person when they actually are undergoing the disease. So we can rule out option C. Then option D, to reach a peak of infectivity and then decline to a curable state. So this is definitely wrong because there's nothing about being in a curable state. And we mentioned just in the few words beforehand that there's profuse bleeding at the pores. So this does not suggest that they're reaching a curable state. So we can rule out option D. And that makes option A the correct answer to question 2. So, time for a GAMSAT top tip. So if you don't know the meaning of a word, always read the text surrounding it. So just like in the question we saw, the use of the word dissolution was asked about. And although you might know it, if you didn't, we just need to look at the surrounding text to find the words such as death and fatal to know that this is going to reflect the word dissolution. So as I just said, in question 2, you are asked for the meaning of the word dissolution. So the sentences prior mention the words death and fatal, which should help you decide between options A and B, death and fatal. So A portrayed finality, which is parallel to death, whereas B suggests a state of disrepair, which didn't incorporate the finality that death causes. And therefore that led us to the correct answer of option A. Now, moving on to question 3. Again, if you'd like to pause the video and have a go at answering this question. Question 3 is asking us about the genre of this short story. So as I said at the beginning of this tutorial, it's a very common question to be asked to categorize or place a piece into a specific genre. So definitely become familiar with the different types and how they're applied to different texts. So if we look at the options, option A, political commentary describing the selfishness of the aristocrats. So although the aristocrats are coming across as quite selfish in this piece, it's definitely not the genre in total. So it's all about the Red Death. So there's less of a focus on the selfishness of the aristocrats, and the political commentary, that's definitely not the genre of this story either. So we can rule out option A. Option B, comedy mixed with romance. So this is definitely wrong. There's no sense of comedy throughout, and there's also no romance within this piece. So we can rule out option B quite easily. Option C, horror. So there's definitely a sense of horror throughout this, with the continuous mention of blood, death, and the sieges and the whole descriptions. It's definitely seeming like a horror. Option D is a crime thriller. So although there are people dying, this isn't a crime thriller in the sense that this is actually a natural phenomenon. It's a plague. It's not people actually being murdered. So it's not going to be a crime thriller. And that makes option C the correct answer to question 3. So a GAMSAT top tip. So as I mentioned, identifying the genre is very important. So as we just saw, the theme of death was really prevalent throughout the story, and images of gore and blood were provoked throughout. So this narrowed your choices down to C and D, so either a horror or a crime thriller. The plot of the story was based upon the Red Death, which is a plague, and therefore ruled out the possibility of the story being a crime thriller. Another top tip, so when you're asked to identify the genre of a story, always think about the setting, the character types, the themes, the mood, and the plot. And we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So when asked to identify the genre of a story, there's a few things to think about that will help you to lead to the correct genre. So firstly, the setting. So this is where and when the story will take place. So always think about the geographical location, the historical and the social context, as these all tend to influence the storyline and the characters involved. Next, always think about the character types. So these are the characteristics, their attitudes, beliefs, and the certain type of people involved, and always think about the relationships between them. Next are the themes. So similar to genres, these are kind of the feelings and the categories of them. So the theme might be of love, of mystery, there might be a theme of murder, of war. Then the mood, similar to the theme, this is the feeling that you experience whilst reading a piece. And then finally, the plot. So this is the actual storyline. So what is happening, what's happened throughout, if there's any changes, any events. So definitely bear in mind these 5 things when I'm trying to identify a genre. Now moving on to question 4. Again, if you'd like to pause the video and have a go at answering question 4. Now we'll go through the solution to question 4. So question 4 asks us for the meaning of ingress or egress in the second paragraph. So again, if we're asked for the meaning of a specific phrase or a word, we'll go to where it is in the passage and just search around for any clues. So ingress or egress is mentioned here in the second paragraph. So if we look around, we see that this is to do with the walls that have been put up around the aristocrats, and it's to leave means neither of, so we're preventing ingress or egress, the sudden impulses of despair or frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. So we get the sense that the aristocrats have gone into a special abbey by themselves and are trying to exclude the public. So this wall had gates of iron, the courtiers having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolt shut. So this is all giving us a sense that this is to do with barricading themselves and preventing entry of people who are not aristocrats. So if we look at the answer options, we'll see if anything matches up. So A, coming and going of individuals to and from the castle. So this is exactly what this gives a sense of. If we substituted the words coming and going, instead of ingress or egress, the sentence makes sense. So that's also a way of checking if the interpretation of a word or phrase is correct, is by replacing it with the suggested answer. And in this case, if we use the words coming and going, it would fit in very well in this text. So we'd say they resolved to leave means neither of coming or going to the sudden impulses of despair or frenzy from within. So A is very likely. B, authority to dictate the entrance and exit of persons. So it seems as though we're welding the bolt shut and we're just actually forming a wall. There's not a sense that there's going to be authority or security actually monitoring who gets in or out. They're simply leaving everyone outside of the walls to stay outside. So we can rule out option B. Option C, advance or reduce the levels of capabilities of a person. So this isn't to reduce the level of capabilities of a person, this is just simply to keep people from entering the abbey. So we can rule out option C. Now, option D, to limit the actions of people by controlling their entrance and exit. So this is definitely limiting their ability to enter, but it's not so much their actions, and it doesn't make as much sense. So it's also just to prevent normal people who are not aristocrats from entering. So we can rule out option D. And that makes option A the correct answer to question 4. Now, moving on to question 5. Again, if you'd like to pause the video and have a go at answering question 5. So question 5 asks, what is the purpose of Prince Prospero's actions? So if we look at the options, A, to protect the citizens of his own town from the Red Death. So we know that it's not just his citizens who have been allowed to enter and then have the walls closed to the others. It's actually just his aristocrats, and we know that from the start of paragraph 2. So when his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court. So whilst the citizens of his town were half depopulated, so half had been killed by this death, he only actually welcomed those from his courtship, so his knights and dames of his court. So it wasn't actually protect the citizens of his town. So you can rule out option A. Option B, to protect those of the same social standing as him from the civilians who were being starved by the Red Death. So he definitely is trying to protect those of the same social standing, but it's not from the civilians who are being starved by the Red Death, it's from the Red Death itself and from those infected. So option B is also incorrect. So option C. So to invite those of the same social standing as him to partake in a final time of partying and carelessness with the understanding that demise from the Red Death is inevitable. So we see from the text that he did actually plan to have a party in this. So we mentioned that there were buffoons, improvisatori, ballet dancers, musicians, beauty, wine. So he definitely plans on having a good time and socializing within. However, he does not believe that the demise from the Red Death is inevitable. So he says, with such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. So he actually thinks and believes that by barricading themselves in, they will be able to avoid the Red Death. So option C is incorrect. So moving on to option D, although this is the only option left, we'll still go through it. So to protect those the same social standing as him from the Red Death. So as we've said, he says that he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court. So these are people of the same social standing, whilst attempting to distract them from what was unfolding outside of the castle walls. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's retiring to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. The external world could take care of itself. So he's aiming to exclude the external world and avoid what was actually happening and ignore it. So option D is definitely the correct answer to question 5. Now, moving on to a new unit. So before you answer question 6, remember to have a read through the piece, thinking about the setting, the theme, the genre, the characters, and the mood. And then have a go at question 6. So, before going on to question 6, I'll have a read of the piece itself, and I see it's from Life Above Sea Level. So if I read question 6, which of the following statements best matches what can be assumed to be the uncle's expectations of dropping the child in the water? So we see in paragraph 1, this is where the child is dropped in the water. So we're going to be focusing here to find our answer. So we see, sink or swim, my mother's brother says, as he drops me from the side of the boat into the Great South Bay. Then he proceeds to describe the sensation of what happens whilst he's been dropped in the water. It ends with, funny, they said, it works so well with all the other kids. So option A, the child will be distraught and learn to respect the ocean. So the uncle doesn't expect to make the child distraught or for him to respect the ocean. He talks about it working well for the other kids. So we assume here that the plan was that he would learn to swim. Even as the uncle first stated at the beginning, sink or swim. So the plan was to actually teach him how to swim with this. So he definitely did not want the child to be distraught and learn to respect the ocean. There's nothing to support this. So option A can be eliminated. Option B, the child would swim by themselves. So as we said, between the text, so the quote from the uncle, and the actual actions, and the fact that it worked for the other kids, we get the sense that he was actually attempting to teach the nephew to swim. So option B is quite likely. Option C, the child will be able to swim alongside the uncle with minimal support. So the point of this was to not need any support at all. So it was sink or swim. It wasn't sink, swim, or swim with support. So option B is still a better option than C. So we can rule out option C. Now, option D, the child would drown. So this is definitely not the expectation. So although it's sink or swim, so it's one or the other, He did end with saying that it works so well with all the other kids, so he was definitely expecting it to be the same result as the other children, in which we can assume that they did actually manage to swim. So we can rule out option D, and therefore option B is the correct option. So the uncle definitely expected the child to be able to swim by themselves, just as it did for all the other kids that he'd done this with. Now, on to question 7. Again, if you'd like to pause the video and have a go at answering question 7. So question 7, what is the author's reaction to being dropped in the water? So again, this is all going to be in paragraph 1, where he actually describes the experience of being dropped in the water. And we see, so after being dropped in the water, he says, water fills my nose and lungs and I'm scooped out by a strong-armed uncle. So it's quite matter of fact. He only describes what happens. He doesn't really attach any feelings or emotions to it. So if we look at option A, despair and upset. So be careful here not to assume, because obviously the idea and the image of water filling his nose and lungs is not a pleasant one. So you might yourself believe that he would have been upset, although he doesn't actually explicitly state this. So we can't assume. So we're going to have to rule out option A. Option B, anger and shock. So again, be careful not to assume and interpret your own feelings towards this event, because the author himself has not said this. So we're going to have to rule out B, although you probably expect that he was a bit shocked after being dropped in the water. Option C, unreactive to the experience. So that's definitely the sense we get. He's very matter of fact and just describes the actual physical experiences that happened and not his own emotional experience. So option C is likely. Option D, overwhelmed by the experience. So again, there's nothing to suggest that he was overwhelmed. There's no emotion or any feelings actually fully expressed here. So we can rule out option D. And that leaves option C as the correct answer to question 7. So this is a common trap. So in the question we just did, question 7, you were asked about the author's reaction to being dropped in the water. So when reading this, you may have considered this to be quite a negative experience, and would have assumed that this experience itself would have been negative to the author, with his nose filling with water as well as his lungs. So it may have led you to some of the other answer options. However, you had to interpret exactly what the author said, and in this case, he didn't attach any emotion or negative feelings to it. So be careful not to just assume or let your own feelings cloud your judgment on the actual author's perspective, and pay attention to exactly what he said. Now, moving on to question 8. Again, if you'd like to pause the video and have a go at this question. Question 8 asks us about the result of stating Irish as its own sentence. So we see that that is in paragraph 2 here. So we know now that we're just going to be focusing on paragraph 2. If we look, he's describing his mother's family. So my mother's family, police detectives, payroll clerks, and Brooklyn Navy Yard workers, Irish. So remember to read this story in your head as if it were aloud, just so that you can interpret the different emphasis and the effects of certain punctuation. So definitely by having Irish as its own word in a sentence adds emphasis to it. So you pause before starting it and then you pause again after, which really has an impact and makes it stand out. So we look at the options. A, emphasizes the word and focuses the author's attention to it. So that's exactly what it just did when we read it out loud. So option A is likely. Option B, it communicates the author's lack of certainty about including the fact they're Irish in the story. So that's definitely not it. If it's by itself in a sentence, it is actually standing out and emphasizing it. So it doesn't give us a sense that there's a lack of certainty. So we can rule out option B. Option C, highlights the author's distaste of being of an Irish background and how they view it negatively. So although there is perhaps a negative view on the rest of it, we can't actually assume that he has a negative view of his mother's family being Irish, because again, he's stating it. It's quite matter of fact, Just like how he described the experience of being dropped into the water, he's not actually attaching emotion to it. So again, we can't assume that he's viewing this as negatively. So we can rule out option C. Option D highlights the author's pride for being Irish and communicates they perceive it to be a key part of their identity. So again, we don't actually know his emotion or his feelings towards the Irishness, so we can't assume that it's pride. Although perhaps because it's a word just by itself in a sentence, we could maybe assume it would make it a key part of their identity because he's emphasizing it. We can't assume that he is proud of it. So we can rule out option D. And that leaves us with option A, which is also the safest option. We haven't assumed anything, and I think everyone would agree that by having it in its own sentence, it's emphasizing it. So option A is the correct answer to question 8. Now, moving on to the final question, question 9 of this tutorial. Again, if you'd like to pause the video, have a go at answering it, and then resume it and we'll go through the solutions. So question 9. What is the tone with which the author describes the place described in paragraph 2? So again, we know that we're going to be focusing on paragraph 2 here for the answer. And we see that he describes the place he's at. So this is a place where men come to catch blues, weekend fishermen after a perfect run, where women wash clothes in ice-cold water, then hang them on lines cast toward the bay. Line-dried clothes, stiff and hard, that stink of bay water and don't bend easily against the skin. So it's not the most positive light, I think we can all agree. So if we look at option A, the author communicates a lack of affection towards the place, viewing it to be a cold and hostile place. So there is a definite lack of affection for the place. He doesn't ever express anything in a positive light, and we can only assume that this is quite a negative image at the very end of the clothes. However, he doesn't seem to view it as a cold and hostile place. So nothing is that extreme or that negative to assume this, so we can rule out option A. Option B, the author portrays the place negatively, displaying clear resentment toward it. So again, it may be slightly negative, however there is no clear resentment towards it. He's still quite matter of fact when he's talking about the clothes being hard and smelling of bay water that don't bend easily against the skin. But again, resentment would be too strong a word because he hasn't actually stated enough of his own emotions and opinions. So we can rule out option B. Option C, the author speaks affectionately of the place, considering it in a positive light. So this is definitely not the case. Although we're saying that we can't use the words strong enough such as resentment and hostile and cold, he's definitely not speaking of it in a positive light. When he talks about the clothes being stiff and hard that stink of bay water and don't bend easily against the skin. Even the use of the word stink instead of smell. Stink is normally a negative word, so again we can definitely say it's not a positive light, so we can rule out option C. So we're left with option D. The author does not write of the place with much emotion, but a lack of affection for the place is evident. So that's definitely the safest option out of all of these. There is a definite lack of emotion, just like there was in paragraph 1, and there is a lack of affection. So although it's not overly negative in the sense of resentment or hostility, it's also not positive. So this is definitely a good answer option to go for. And therefore, the answer to the final question, question 9, is option D. So another GAMSAT top tip. So when asked about the tone or the attitude of a character or the author, pay attention to the words and the language used and consider why these specific words were chosen. So in question 9, you are asked about the tone with which the author described the place. So when describing the washing of the clothes and the place, they described the water as ice cold and the clothes as stiff and hard. It was also referring to the smell of the bay water as the stink. So these all conjure up negative feelings and images and help us to interpret their attitude towards the place without them explicitly saying their actual feelings. So now for your take-home points. So always remember to take the time to read the passage fully before moving on to the questions so that you gain a full understanding. Then whilst you're reading, always consider the theme, the plot, emotions and attitudes, and also become familiar with the various short story genres and revise the literary terms that we went through at the beginning. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you again in the next tutorial.